I'm excited about our topic today because it's years in the making. It's really been 25 years that I've been learning the principles that I'm going to talk to you about today. And whether you're looking to learn how to interact better with people that you're serving who may be living with dementia or other types of cognitive or mental health challenges, or you're looking for ways to interact better in every relationship of your life, I think this is going to be really impactful for you. And I call what we're going to talk about the vital five pillars of effective interaction. So let me first tell you where the vital five pillars come from, because some of you are new and you might not know this. Some of you that have been with us for a while have probably heard this story. But years ago, the Alzheimer's Association approached me and said, Eric, we want you to be the keynote speaker at a family caregiver conference. And the topic would be how to deal with really difficult situations. So imagine a spouse taking care of a loved one with dementia, like husband and wife. Husband's got advanced Alzheimer's, and he gets angry one day and comes at his wife and says, "Who are you?" And she says, "Well, I'm your wife, Susan." And he says, "No, you're not. Get out of my house." How do you deal with that kind of situation? Well, at the time, I was teaching an 18-hour workshop course for master's students at Boise State University, and a lot of what we covered in that course was this type of thing. How do you deal with the tough stuff? And so I was excited to accept the speaking opportunity. And at the end of planning the conference, the meeting planner said, "Oh, by the way, you're going to have 25 minutes to present this." And I thought my head was going to blow up. I didn't know how I would condense what took me the better part of an 18-hour course into such a short period of time in 25 minutes. So I just said yes. I had already agreed we were moving forward, and I decided that I would prepare by just dumping out on paper everything that I had ever learned or tried or read about that worked in situations where people had dementia. And as I did that, I noticed that everything kind of filtered into five principles. It was like there were five things that all the good technique came from. They kind of jumped off the page, and I realized, well, I could talk about five things in 25 minutes. So I did. And at the end of the presentation, there was nice applause. It felt like a good thing. And I stepped off stage intending to go get a drink and use the bathroom and come back for the rest of the conference. And instead, there was a lineup of people waiting to talk, asking questions, saying, "That was really helpful. That unlocked a lot of things for me." And that was the beginning of realizing that I was on to something. And I've gone on to share the Vital Five Pillars on stages in 39 of the 50 states. There are healthcare professionals all over the country that use these principles. And there are a lot of people who have benefited from leveraging them in their own lives. So let's dig in. Now, since this started as a framework to help in dementia care, I want to point out what we're dealing with when it comes to the most common form of dementia, Alzheimer's disease. This is a picture of what a healthy segment of brain looks like compared to a diseased brain with advanced Alzheimer's. Dramatic difference, lots of shrinkage. You see that the hippocampi, the memory center of the brain, is dramatically shrunken. That's because that's ground zero for Alzheimer's disease. And of course, we see enlarged ventricles and the sulci are wider. There's a lot of tissue loss. The brain loses 50 to 70% of its mass by end-stage Alzheimer's disease. Now, I show you this picture because it leads to an understanding of a principle that's not only important in Alzheimer's, but it's important in all sorts of situations in life. Mental health situations, other neurodegenerative diseases, even just how people are functioning from day to day. An understanding of what a disease like Alzheimer's looks like helps us understand two principles that are related. The first is that behavior is communication. Whatever people are doing is communicating. In fact, when I got a degree in communication back in the 90s, people would say all the time in our communication classes, humans cannot not communicate. And I think that's really true. Everything that we do is communication. But communication is also manifest through behavior, and behavior is an outward manifestation of an internal state. I think that idea that what we're seeing outwardly tells us something about what's happening inwardly is important. So if the memory center of your brain is a great big crater and it measures in the first percentile when you do an MRI, then outwardly the behavior is going to be memory loss. When I'm standing in a grocery store line and I see someone interacting with the checker in a rude way, I don't think, what a jerk. I actually think, what's going on with their frontal lobe that would cause them to be so emotionally labile, where they'd go from like calm to really irritated and agitated for almost no good reason? And why are they not having insight that this is not an effective way to handle things? Now, there could be a lot of stuff going on in a situation like that, but once you learn to see the world through the lens that behavior is an outward manifestation of something going on physiologically, or at least there's a huge influence with that, at least for me, it's made me more patient with other people, more understanding that maybe there's more going on than we can see. Now, to start learning the vital five pillars, we need to lay a little bit of groundwork. And to do that, I want to tell you about an experience that I had at a grocery store many years ago. My wife Amy and I had planned a Christmas party for our four children. And we had never at that point had Christmas at our own house. We were always having Christmas at my parents' house or my wife's parents' house. So this was the first time that we were going to celebrate at our house. And we were really excited. We went off to a local grocery store, and there we were on the beverage aisle discussing what drinks our children might like to have when I heard a sound that always gets my attention because I have a little bit of PTSD. It was the sound of an electric wheelchair. I've been run into many times throughout my career by little old ladies that didn't have driver's licenses anymore and probably shouldn't be driving electric wheelchairs. And they've seen me in the hall and said, "Oh, Eric, I need to ask you something." And they've pulled the joystick and run into me in the process. It's a pretty common thing, at least for me. And so I heard this electric wheelchair and I looked and then I did a double take because I saw something that I've never seen before or since. There was a young man, looked like he was about 20, and he was a total quadriplegic, no arms or legs. And he had a homemade looking device kind of strapped to the left stump and connected to the joystick of that wheelchair. And he was steering it by just leaning his torso. It was impressive. I stared awkwardly for a little bit, and then I realized what I was doing, and I turned back and was talking to my wife. And that young man went down to the other end of the aisle. A couple of minutes later, I heard the wheelchair come up behind me and it stopped. And I heard an "Excuse me, sir." And I turned around and he smiled up at me and he said, "I'm trying to get some iced tea off the shelf down here. Could you get it for me?" Now imagine that you're there watching this, you're listening, you're taking it all in as I turned to him and said, "I know it's really hard, but if you try just a little bit harder, I bet you could do it yourself." Well, you would probably be offended. You'd probably think I'm a complete jerk. You'd probably say, "Well, if he won't, I will." And you'd walk to the end of the aisle and get the iced tea off the shelf. What's painfully obvious in a moment like this to anybody watching is this young man doesn't have arms or legs. There's no way that he could get that iced tea off the shelf. Now, I didn't actually respond the way that I first suggested. I walked to the end of the aisle. I got the iced tea off the shelf. I put it in his basket. And as I was walking back up the aisle toward my wife, and he was off in the opposite direction, I had a flash of insight. I realized in that moment that I wasn't debating in myself whether or not I was enabling him in some way or what was right or what was wrong. It was just obvious what I needed to do. Because when people have missing or damaged body parts, we see the need. I realized in that moment that when I was in college and I broke my ankle in the middle of the winter, and there I was hobbling around the University of Utah on crutches with slick conditions, people would offer to help. They would open the door for me without me asking. If it looked like I was struggling to carry things, sometimes people would offer to assist. We're good as humans at helping others when we see the need. And when people have missing or damaged body parts, we're especially good at seeing that they might need some help with things. Unless those missing or damaged body parts are on the inside, as in neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, when someone's brain has lost significant mass and it doesn't function the way that it should, one of the biggest problems we're up against is we don't see that need. It's on the inside. And so people end up saying really dumb things like, "Don't you remember? Well, to say, don't you remember to someone who's missing the body part that would allow them to hang on to information and recall it is crazy. It's just as crazy as if I had told that quadriplegic in the grocery store to try harder to do it himself when it's obvious that he couldn't. Now, one of the bigger problems is all the ways that we imply, don't you remember? And that's what really gets us into trouble. It's easy to remember to cut don't you remember out of your vocabulary when you're around someone with dementia. But what about implying it? One of the scenarios that I love to role play with people when I'm doing a live workshop goes kind of like this, and I'll describe it to you. I want you to imagine that you're at a restaurant and you're minding your own business. You're there with some friends and you've had a good time chatting with them, but you decide that you need to get up and use the bathroom. And when you do, a server spots you from across the room, looks panicked, and runs across the room, practically leaping over a chair and past other furniture in the process, and grabs you by the shoulders and says, "It's not safe. You've got to sit down." That would be devastating. That would be shocking. That would be really incongruent with normal experience. We wouldn't even know what to do with that. Last time I checked, when Crazy shows up at the front door, we slam the door in Crazy's face. We would think that they'd lost their mind. But that's actually the scenario that happens in many long-term care settings when someone who's living with dementia, who's had a lot of falls, and the staff knows that they're at risk for falls, stands up in the dining room or anywhere else for that matter. If someone with dementia who's had 30 falls in the last month and moves into a facility so that people can keep a close eye on them, stands up in the dining room, if you're a well-meaning staff member and you see them from across the room, you're naturally triggered right out of the gate to do the wrong thing. You're triggered to run over there, grab them to steady them, and try to save the day. And you sit them down. And I see it all over the place. When I'm on site consulting with places, I'll see people stand up and other staff run over and sit them right back down. And what that's implying is, don't you remember, it's not safe to stand. But if they had the body parts that would allow them to remember, they wouldn't be standing in the first place. Now, we're not just going to let people fall. We need to create what's called the illusion of control. Things need to feel normal and natural to the person, even though they're not. You see, if you're not dealing with a full-size, robust, effective memory center of the brain, you still might think that things are normal in the moment. And so things need to feel normal to you. So how would we do that? Well, it's completely different if you see someone with dementia and your eyebrows go up and you smile and your arms come out and you call the person by name and you say, "Scott, it's so good to see you." And you hustle over because you're playing the role of a long-lost friend. If they feel like you're approaching as a friend and you put your arm around them and you say, "I remember the first time we met." And then you give some social proof that you know they remember because it's stuff that they repeat all the time. When you do that, people are much more likely to assume that, "Oh, this is my friend." And then they might be thinking, "How do I know this person?" But most of us as humans fake it till we make it in a situation like that. And many people with dementia respond very differently to an approach like that, where instead of the stranger freaking out and sitting them down, we're the friend coming up. When we put our arm around them to provide stability, they perceive it as we're being a friend. And if at all possible, rather than sitting people down, we could say things like, "Let's go for a walk." If they're capable of walking with stability, then that's actually a good opportunity to connect with them, to figure out why they might be standing, to do some detective work to figure things out. Now, that may not work universally 100% of the time, but the idea behind this is don't imply, "Well, don't you remember it's not safe to stand? And don't you remember my name's Eric and I work here? And oh, you live here, by the way. I know you've forgotten that, but I want you to try really hard to use the body parts that you're missing to remember what you can't. And let's both be frustrated when you don't." We don't need to apply any of that stuff. Now, one of the reasons that so many people don't do what I just described is that they fall into a trap. It's a huge problem in healthcare. And to help us better understand the trap, I want to give you an analogy. This is a performance that was done in 2007 by world-class violinist Joshua Bell, who was a child prodigy. He started playing professionally as a child, and he's performed in all the major concert halls of the world. This performance was different. It was in the Washington, D.C. metro station, and it was done because the Washington Post newspaper wanted to know what would happen if you take a world-class violinist and put them in the middle of a very public place. How would they do compared to the average street performer? Well, here's just a little bit of security camera footage. Well, if you were watching closely, you probably didn't see many people stopping because there weren't. So let's consider a few facts. He was playing a Stradivarius violin that he paid about $3.5 million for. So you can't complain about the quality of the instrument. And he normally earns about $1,000 a minute if you add up the box office receipts and do the math. He played for 45 minutes, but out of 1,097 people who walked by in that time, only 7 stopped. And one was a super fan who recognized him under the disguise and was probably thinking, free Joshua Bell concert. This is amazing. So basically 6 people out of over 1,000 stopped on the merits of the performance. No better than the average street performer. And out of the 27 people who passed by and dropped some money in his case, he made a whopping $32.17. Now, if you're used to earning, let's say, $15 an hour and you start making $32.17 in 45 minutes, that's when you rethink your career options. But if you're Joshua Bell, you have an identity crisis. You start wondering if it's all been a dream. He was later interviewed and he said it was one of the hardest performances of his life because he was questioning everything. He thought, if I was actually good, wouldn't people be stopping? Nobody treated him badly. Nobody threw tomatoes at him. Nobody yelled at him to cut that racket out. They just didn't treat him like Joshua Bell. And that was the problem. So what does this have to do with the discussion that we're having here about the vital 5 pillars? Well, first and foremost, it teaches us that context matters. When we as humans see something or someone out of context, we make incorrect assumptions. It also is a reminder of what happens all the time in long-term care settings, and if we're not careful, even in our own homes. So let's imagine that we're working in a memory care community and a family comes in to set up a room for their dad. He's going to move in. He'll be our new resident. And they put up some pictures. And the first picture that we see is this one. We come in, we check on the family. We might think, well, he's a handsome guy. Seems to like cats. He's got kind eyes. We wouldn't know that much more about him. What if we saw a picture of him when he was younger? We might think he's aged pretty well. And it doesn't look like he's lived his life under a bridge somewhere. Who is he? And we would naturally start eventually gravitating toward, why is he moving in? People don't just move into memory care communities because they want to. They have needs. And eventually we'd put together an interim care plan. We would know what assistance he needs with bathing and dressing and toileting and whether he needs reminders to take any sort of medication, etc. And people would go in his room and we would treat him with all the dignity and respect that we have to offer. But he would feel just like Joshua Bell on the subway. Because most of the time when his picture was taken, he looked like this. All 3 pictures are of Sir Charles Spencer Chaplin, otherwise known as Charlie Chaplin, Hollywood legend. If you're going in to take care of someone and to assist a person who's a Hollywood legend, and you don't know that, it's not that you treat him badly. In this case, you just don't treat him like Charlie Chaplin. And it robs them of their identity. So we have to overcome that. And the thing that stands in our way relates to the first of the vital 5 pillars that we need to learn. I've spent some time setting this up because I think it relates to one of the biggest problems that we have as humans. The reason that people missed some things with Joshua Bell, and one of the reasons that people miss things when they're serving individuals, as in this example with Charlie Chaplin, is that they fall into a trap called the task trap, which means we as humans have a really easy time slipping into being too busy and being routine focused. We avoid interpersonal responsibility and we start putting tasks ahead of people. In other words, if you go straight to the task, you're going to fail to one degree or another. Step 1 in every interaction is to make a meaningful connection with the other person. We let friends and family help us with things all the time. We let people that we feel close to assist. We want them in our lives. We don't tend to let random strangers or people that we don't trust assist us. And when someone begins to need help, especially if they need help with things like activities of daily living, bathing, dressing, toileting, etc., it becomes very easy to define success as checking it off a list and getting the tasks done. A care plan is just a list of tasks. And yet if we made care plans for most of us, wouldn't they look about the same? Most of us are independent in bathing, independent in dressing, independent in toileting, independent in eating, etc. We manage our ADLs by ourselves. Well, if that's the case, then we also need to confront the fact that who we are is completely different than our activities of daily living. Who we are as humans, our identity, well, that's largely what happens after those activities of daily living are completed. They don't really define us. If we don't understand that, then we run the risk of robbing others around us of their very identity. And yet, there are many institutional norms that increase our susceptibility to falling into the task trap. Things like care plans and admission procedures and rules and policies and regulations and job descriptions, they're all basically lists of tasks. So we have to understand their limitations. And we need to understand that there's a strong tendency to define success as, yep, I got him in the shower. Yep, I bathed him. Yes, I did all these things. But we can do any of those things in a person-centered way or in a task-centered way. So the first of the vital 5 pillars is to terminate the task trap. Don't fall into that. And the way that we terminate the task trap is by seeing who people really are and making a meaningful connection with them. That is step 1 in every single interaction that we have. And even in everyday life, whether it's with our family members, our friends, strangers that we're just meeting for the first time, or anyone else, step 1 is to connect with people. There's got to be some interpersonal warmth if we're going to move ahead and accomplish anything. Consider your 2 homes, for example. You got the home that you live in, and then you have the home that you take with you, called your personal and intimate space. Now, if someone knocked at the front door of your physical house, and you opened it and there was a random stranger there, most people would not say, well, come on in. Most people wouldn't let that person anywhere near the inside of their house unless they had enough of a conversation that they really built trust and they understood, okay, now I know who this person is and why they're here, and I'm going to let them in. If you said, may I help you, to a stranger at the door, and they said, yeah, I just wanted to get a look inside, and they barged right past you, you'd fight for your life. That's terrifying. And yet we do exactly these kinds of things when we interact with others if we're not consciously aware of our second home. We all have personal space. That's conversational distance, the distance that we would talk to a good friend. Intimate space, for most people, at least in North America, is anything closer than about 1.4 feet. Intimate space and personal space have to be breached all the time when we're assisting people with things like bathing and dressing and toileting, etc. Interpersonal space also matters in all of our interactions. Even if we're around someone who doesn't need any of our physical assistance, We still need permission to be in that space. We all know what it's like to be walking down a hallway or something and to have a person kind of in our path, and we try to get past each other, and maybe we both step in the same direction. And then it's that awkward dance where you're trying to get past the other person. It's awkward. It doesn't feel good to have other people in our personal and intimate space when they don't have permission to be there. So the first thing that we need to do with others is establish that permission, establish that trust. And if we're going to connect with someone that has profound memory loss, we need to understand how they think. Both short-term and long-term memory can be affected in people who are living with dementia. But long-term memory is what gets us into a lot of trouble. Long-term memory is kind of like an onion or a tree. It's in layers. So think of the earliest memories in life as like the core of that onion. And then you have other childhood memories and teenage memories and young adult memories. And we add layer upon layer upon layer till we get to current reality. But sometimes when people have diseases like Alzheimer's and their brain can't support that full-size adult network, things start to downsize. And at first, it's like they don't remember the last year very well. And then maybe 5 years kind of evaporate. And eventually, it's like peeling the onion. And the outer layer still feels like current reality, but it's not. For most people with dementia, they remember things best that happened between ages 15 and 30. That's pretty common because between 15 and 30, we have a lot of firsts in life. First car, first date, first kiss, first child, first house, etc. The brain superglues those kinds of memories in. There are a whole lot of other memories, like what did you eat for breakfast today, that are sticky note memories. Most normal adults remember very well what they ate for breakfast today or if they skipped breakfast. But don't ask me what I ate for breakfast 3 weeks ago today. I don't remember that because that's a sticky note memory and the glue has worn off. But I can tell you vivid memories of things that happened decades ago because they were superglued in my brain. And many people with dementia can remember some key details of what happened earlier in life. They often remember what I like to call the highlight reel of life, the key high points of things that they've done. And sometimes not all of that gets remembered either. But in general, many people living with dementia feel like they're younger than they are, like their children are younger than they are, like things are at a different place in time because they just aren't hanging on to as many of the current memories. Well, how do we deal with all that? Let me illustrate the task trap and then lead into the second of the vital 5 pillars by telling you about a woman that I took care of for about 6 years. We'll call her Susan. Susan had pretty advanced dementia, and every day between about 3 and 5 o'clock, she would get mad. And she would start walking around with her walker first, and later on she was in a wheelchair, and she would just motate around, and she would say, "Have you seen Steve? Where is Steve? Where's the phone? Does anyone know how I can call Steve? Where is Lubkin Street? Can I walk to Lubkin Street from here?" Well, Steve, her husband, had died 30 years earlier. Lubkin Street was where she lived as a child, but that was the house that she remembered. Now, she remembered her daughter, Pam. She remembered her other daughter, and she would ask for her husband. Now, you can't just tell her that her husband passed away 30 years ago. Some people would relive the grief. Not Susan. When Pam tried to tell her gently one day that Daddy had passed away, she looked at her incredulously and said, "I don't know what kind of game you're playing. I saw your father this morning. He's fine." Now, Susan thought that she was in a hotel. If you don't know why she thought that, go to a local memory care community and look around. Many of them look kind of like a hotel. So it was a reasonable assumption. And a hotel is a safe place to be if you have a reason to be there. So how do we help someone like Susan in this situation? Well, step one, we already know. The first of the vital 5 pillars is to terminate the task trap by seeing who Susan really is and making a meaningful connection. And my favorite way to do that is to play the role of the long-lost friend. So I would walk up to Susan and say, "Susan, oh, it's so good to see you. I remember the first time I met you. Your daughter Pam invited me over to the house. Isn't it on Lubkin Street?" Now, notice I'm leveraging some information that she remembers, and I know she remembers it because she repeats it over and over and over. She knows who Pam is, and even though she hasn't lived on Lubkin Street since she was a kid, That's what she remembers, so that's what I use. And just that fast, in a matter of seconds, I become a family friend. And Susan would start to calm down a little bit and saying, "Oh, that's right, you know Pam. Have you seen Steve?" Now, that's where I pull out what's called an emotional hook. If someone is lost, distressed, confused, and they have no idea what's going on, the most powerful thing that I can do is carry that emotion for them. And the easiest way to do that is blame myself. So she'd say, "Have you seen Steve?" And I'd say, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I completely forgot to tell you." She'd say, "What is it?" "Steve called." "He did?" And that's when I say what is absolutely true in her world. Now, what I knew about Steve is that he was a traveling salesman. He covered Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, and it was totally normal that sometimes he would call home and say, "Honey, I'm so sorry. I was supposed to be home tonight, but I have this customer in Eugene, Oregon that needs this part, and I'm going to have to stay an extra day." So I leveraged that. I'd say, "I forgot to tell you, Steve called." "He did?" "Yeah, he's been tied up on his sales route in Eugene, Oregon. He said he has to stay one more day. And he asked if you could spend another night here." I told him it would be fine. 9.9 times out of 10, Susan would just calm right down. Her shoulders would relax. She'd exhale and she'd say, "Oh, that's just like him." Or, "I'm so glad I found you. I didn't know what was going on. Are you sure I can stay?" "Absolutely." That's what it takes to terminate the task trap, to get into the world of someone living with dementia. Now, what about everyday life? It's very easy for any of us to fall into the task trap. If we go straight to the task with other human beings, even our own children, it's not going to be as good. I have learned as a father that if I go into one of my children's rooms, knock on the door, let's say that my youngest son is in his room doing something. If I go in and I just say, "Hey, William, we've got to go do this job," it's not the same as if I knock on the door and I take a little bit of time to make a connection. "Hey, how's it going, William? What are you up to?" "Oh, interesting." And we have a little conversation. If I build some trust and increase some warmth, he's actually much more likely to feel good about assisting with whatever it is I might be asking him to do. We can leverage this principle in all of our daily interactions. Now, the example that I gave with Susan is also pretty theatrical. I'm doing a little acting in this. And the second of the vital 5 pillars is to improvise and be in the moment. Now, that's important because, especially for people with dementia, if our lives were like they're experiencing it, then it would be dramatically different. If I could wipe your brain clean of everything that you remember except for the last 5 seconds and 20 years ago and earlier, that would be closer to how many people with dementia are experiencing the world. If you're missing the part of your brain that allows you to hang on to information, but you remember some key details from the past, it's kind of like your life is an exercise in improvisation. Now, we're all just making things up as we go, but for people with dementia, that's especially true. Shakespeare said all the world's a stage, and for people with dementia, it's like they're on a perpetual stage. And we can leverage the rules of improv. The first rule of improvisation is never say no. You say things like yes, and in other words, whatever happens on stage in a literal improv act, well, you treat it as real. You go with it, or else it's not funny, and the drama doesn't unfold in the way that it needs to. And when it comes to being around people with dementia, we need to avoid saying no wherever possible, and we need to avoid implying no. So, for example, one night while I was running a memory care community, I was assisting with a meal. I was just helping our residents who needed assistance to eat. And I spotted a resident standing up. Her name was Margaret. Now, Margaret was about 98 pounds soaking wet. We were trying to help her gain some weight, and she was on a finger food diet. And as I looked over at her, I noticed that she picked up a carrot stick off her plate and she stuck it in her walker basket. And she walked across the room. And by the time I got over there, she had pulled a pillowcase out from her walker basket. I have no idea where she got the pillowcase. Some poor person probably went to bed that night without a pillowcase. But she laid this pillowcase out on her lap. And then she got out the carrot stick and she started moving it along the edge of the pillowcase. It was like she was sewing. Well, most people that I've worked with over the years who haven't received enough training might walk up to the Margarets of the world and say, Margaret, come back to the table. You need to finish your dinner, which is code for, I know you're missing the body parts that would allow you to remember that you were actually sitting at the table a few minutes ago, but I want you to try harder anyway. Margaret's memory was only good for seconds, and it took her a minute or two to get over to the couch, and she had her back turned to the dining area. She didn't remember that she was eating in all likelihood. And a lot of well-meaning people who aren't thinking through this might point to the carrot and say, are you going to eat that carrot? But she's using the carrot like a needle. Now, if we instead say, hey, I'm walking on stage in an improv act, and Margaret's playing her part in the play of life, what's going on here? We might see that, oh, she's sewing. And I knew from Margaret's history that she'd been a seamstress for 30 years, so she was just acting her part in life's play. So instead of being all literal, I stepped on stage in the improv act and I said, Margaret, that's beautiful. Mind if I watch? She kind of nodded approvingly. And so I sat down. And pretty soon she got to the end of the row. She sat the carrot down and she looked up at me. And I connected with her socially. I played the role of the long-lost friend. I gave social proof that I knew her. And then I said, let's go for a walk. She said, okay. So we stood up and I started escorting her back to the dining area. When we got over there, I reintroduced her to the woman that she had been sitting next to as if they were just meeting for the first time. I helped Margaret take a seat. I pointed out that her new friend had some food. And I said, I'll bring you some dinner. She said, thank you. And when I brought the food out, instead of saying, here's the rest of your meal, which would be implying, don't you remember you were eating earlier? I just said, and here's your dinner. She smiled, said thank you, and she ate the rest of her food. Sometimes we have to be that moment to moment when someone has profound memory loss. Now, we also need to recognize that if people are on stage in an improv act, how we set the stage is going to dictate how the action goes. And we don't have a lot of time to get into the nuances here, but how is this stage set? Some memory care communities look like this. This is a picture I pulled from a website of an actual assisted living memory care community, and you'll notice that the locked door goes right to the outside, and it opens into a living room area. Well, that means that some people might sit around thinking that they're in their living room, and if someone that they don't know, like the family member of another resident or someone from a home health agency or whatever, walks through that door, it might feel to some people like a stranger's barging in their house. And that's really just the function of how the stage is set up. Some buildings have a door that people go in and out of that's not in the line of sight of the residents. That's a different stage. The stage is set differently from the left to the right. People on the left are more likely to perceive it as being in somebody's home. And on the right, they might think that it's a restaurant. One is not better than the other, but it's more likely that residents in the setting on the right would be distressed about not finding their purse or their wallet. They might want to offer a tip, and we might need to handle that differently. Now, in everyday life, we also need to be in the moment. Not everybody that we're around has profound memory loss, like someone who's living with dementia. But we have things like cell phones and other digital distractions that prevent us sometimes, or we allow them to prevent us from actually being fully focused, fully present in the moment with the person that we're with. And that can have devastating consequences on our relationships. So we need to be fully focused and realize that listening is the most active thing we can do with another person. The third of the vital 5 pillars is to accommodate sensory deficits. And I have the picture of the monkeys here because see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil could be said accommodate sensory deficits. Now, I often teach some actions with the vital 5 pillars to help people remember these. So let's go through some actions real quick. With terminating the task trap, just make a T. Remind you of the timeout sign. We terminate the task trap by seeing who people are, so we make some binoculars so that we zero in on them, and making a meaningful connection. Pillar 2 was improvise and be in the moment. Pillar 3, accommodate sensory deficits. Sometimes when we pair movement with an idea, it's easier to remember it. So I hope that helps you remember it a little bit better. Now, I chose the monkeys because it's visual and language processing problems. For people with dementia, that cause a lot of the disconnects that we have. So, what about visual changes? Many people with dementing illnesses lose peripheral vision. They lose depth perception. They have a hard time seeing things that are similar in color. They may not even process movement as fluidly as they used to. That can have a profound impact on how they experience the world. If you're trying to get someone who doesn't see things similar in color to sit down on a white shower chair and it's in a white shower, they might not see the shower chair. If we're out for a walk on the sidewalk, well, the sidewalk and the gutter are made of the same concrete. And if they can't tell where the sidewalk ends and the gutter begins, that could be a fall waiting to happen. Same is true in the home. Let's say that they have an upstairs bedroom and there's carpet that then goes down the stairs. If they can't tell where that first step is because they don't see it clearly, that's a problem. If we're serving water in a clear glass, they might not see it. They might be knocking over the glass. There's a study done years ago that's been replicated called the red plate study that showed that people with dementia eat about 25% more food when it's served on a red plate. Why? Because there's visual contrast. And if people are missing peripheral vision and depth perception, then if we approach from the side, we're likely to startle them. Let's suppose that someone has food on their chin and we grab a washcloth and we fall into the task trap. We go straight to the task of trying to assist. If we just reach in and say, here, let me help you with that, they're likely to pull back in fear because they're not seeing movement fluidly. They see a hand here and then here, and pretty soon they might think that we're coming in to take a swing at them. If they swat at us, well, seen through the lens of a visual processing problem, that's a logical thing to do. But if we don't understand what they're doing, we might be inclined to label them as combative or aggressive or resistive to care. And some people would turn to a psychotropic drug to try to control aggressive behavior. What if it's just a visual processing problem and all that we need to do is slow down? We need to approach from the front. We need to get below eye level so that they don't perceive us as a threat. When you walk up to someone and you're hovering over them, what you're basically saying is, I am in control here. And we're trying to create the illusion that they're in control. We can do that by approaching from the front and getting down below eye level so that they can see our face and we can smile at them. That's different than having a hand flying out of nowhere. Now, if you want to experience what it's like for people living with dementia, you can make binoculars like this and blink as fast as you can and then just try to walk around. Or if you put your binoculars up and you look down, most people notice you can't even see your shirt. Well, if you're trying to create the illusion of control and someone has food spilled on their shirt and you walk up and say, oh, I notice you have food on your shirt. If they look down, they don't even see anything. Something feels off. Something's not quite right. That can be a problem for some people. So to accommodate, again, we want to approach from the front, use contrasting colors in the right places, move a little slower than you normally would, tell people what we're going to do before we do it, avoid abrupt transitions in the floor. If you go from a really dark floor to a really light floor, some people will perceive that as a drop or a step, and they might be terrified. Realize that when we're in a narrow hallway or a bathroom or another tight space, we're more likely to get hit and they're more likely to show aggressive behavior because they might not see that there's another person there. They might just see part of us. If you walk up to someone in a wheelchair and you're just standing next to them, all they could see is your chest in front of them. That could be a problem. So we need to be aware of that. We also need to accommodate auditory processing problems. Many people with dementia don't hear things the way that they used to. Nonverbal sounds might not have meaning, so the knock on a door or the sound of water spilling over a clogged sink, it might not register as anything significant to them. Often people with dementia have a shrinking vocabulary. They may only be able to say a handful of words by late stages, and frequently they only understand 50 to 70% of the words that they hear. If you were only hearing and understanding every other word, that would put you at a real disadvantage. So to accommodate, we might need to treat people as if they're speaking their native language as a different language. Um, it's kind of like people who grew up speaking English are now ESL speakers. I don't speak Spanish very well. I took a few years of Spanish in high school, and I know Spanish vocabulary, but I'm not fluent. When I'm around someone who speaks Spanish, I need them to slow down and use simple words and phrases and use a lot of gestures to help me understand what they're actually talking about. Well, that's exactly what we can do for people with dementia. The general rule of thumb for people with advanced dementia is use 7-word chunks or less, and then give people time to process. That's helpful for people. And our natural tendency as humans, when people don't understand what we're saying, is to do more talking and explain more. And in reality, we might need to say a lot less. We might need to use a lot more nonverbal communication instead of words, because that's playing more to their strengths in a lot of cases. Now, how does this apply to all of us? Well, not everybody has visual processing problems or language processing problems, but we do all see the world differently. What's great for one person is terrible for another person. And I like how Stephen Covey put it. He once said, "First, seek to understand, then to be understood." I think we get further in life when we follow that rule, when we take an opportunity to genuinely be interested in the other person and to ask good questions, to try to understand their views as much as possible. That improves every relationship of our lives. So it's important to accommodate sensory deficits or different perceptions in every relationship. The last two of the vital 5 pillars are two of the fastest to talk about and two of the hardest to implement. Our little action, if you're trying to learn that, is to make a V with your hands. And that reminds us to validate emotional experience. So let's talk about how we feel. We have feelings because we have physiology. We have feelings because we have an experience, and it gets filtered through our beliefs, our attitudes, our values, our prior knowledge, our neuroanatomy, and it pops out the other end as a neurochemical hormonal thing called a feeling. And in the moment that we're feeling it, it's real. It's physiological. To dramatically simplify things, we might say, hey, if you're feeling love and connection, your oxytocin is flowing. If you're feeling stress, your cortisol's up. Fight or flight, yeah, you've got some cortisol and adrenaline in the mix. And even though neurotransmitters are much more complicated than that, you get the idea. Now, you would never walk up to the quadriplegic in the grocery store that I told you about earlier and say, I want you to try harder to get the iced tea off the shelf yourself. Or if you had a broken leg and you were in a full leg cast, it would be ridiculous if I walked up to you and said, I know you like jogging. Come on, take the stupid cast off. It's all in your head. That would be crazy. And yet you've probably all had an experience where you were upset and someone said, now just calm down. Well, that's not helpful for most people. That's offensive, it's invalidating, and it gets us into trouble. So let me tell you what validating can look like in the context of dementia care. This is a woman named Carolyn who had 3 kinds of dementia. She had Lewy body dementia, Alzheimer's dementia, and vascular dementia, at least according to her neurologist. And sometimes she would have vivid visual and auditory hallucinations. She would see people who weren't there. She would hear them talking to her. And most of the time, she would see a small crowd of people forming, and it's like they were coming at her. She would walk down the hall like nothing was wrong, and then she'd freeze. She'd say, what? Stop that. You can't say that. Get away from me. It was really hard to watch. And at first, well-meaning staff members would walk up to Carolyn, and they'd say, oh, Carolyn, this is terrible. Let's go for a walk. And she would take a swing at them. Because if you're locked in what you think is the fight of your life, and someone walks up like they're tiptoeing through the tulips and like nothing's wrong, and their demeanor is very calm, that could be invalidating. And it was upsetting for her. So one day I experimented. I did something different. She was yelling at those people, and I just joined the fight. I stood next to her, and I started mirroring the same kinds of things that she was doing to those people. I said, you can't say that. Stop that. Get away from us. And pretty soon she turned to me and she said, yeah. And I thought, oh, I'm her sidekick now. It's kind of like if you're Iron Man and you're losing the fight and the Incredible Hulk shows up and the tide turns and you start winning the battle, you calm down a little bit because you've got a partner in this fight. And so I realized that her brain was doing its job to diminish her stress hormones. I thought, oh, cortisol levels dropping. What could we do to release endorphins? Well, there's three possibilities: laughter, positive physical contact, or physical activity. I couldn't exactly put my arm around her and say, let's go for a walk. She hadn't implied permission that she was comfortable with me doing that. So I just defaulted to laughter. And I said, you know what I'm going to do to those people? She kind of looked at me sideways and I said, I'm just going to skip away. And I started skipping down the hall, waving my arms like a clown. And she began to laugh. So I skipped dramatically to the end of the hall, flipped a 180, came skipping back, stopped a few feet away from her. And I stood there and I smiled at her. And she was giggling. And she said, I'm glad you're here. I said, me too. As I put my arm around her and I said, let's get out of here. Good idea. Well, that's what it took to get her out of that bad moment. And that's what validating emotional experience can look like. And for most of us, instead of observing and labeling emotion, we look at emotion and we say, is this good? Is this bad? Oh, I shouldn't be feeling this way. Or we tell people, just calm down. That's categorizing and judging. We say, is it good or bad? And then we judge it. What we need to do is observe and label. We need to say, you seem frustrated. You seem sad. Or I notice that I'm feeling tense. I notice my shoulders are tightening up. I'm getting stressed. Well, that's non-judgmental. That actually helps people and ourselves have a little bit more control. And it's different than what most of us do. Now, the last of the vital 5 pillars is that life history is our most important tool because it gives us two things. So to remember this, you just make an L with your left hand. And the two tools are the points of the L. Life history gives us context and it gives us identity. It allows us to understand how a person who's on stage in an improv act is interpreting the context. And it allows us to understand how they see themselves. So let me tell you about Art, and then we'll wrap up here. Art owned a meatpacking business. And all day long, he would go station to station checking on his people. They loved him. He was not a guy that sat in the corner office and barked out edicts to his staff. He worked in the trenches with them and supported them all along the way. And on the weekends, he coached his kids' little league teams. He went to mass every Sunday. He was just a really good guy. And when he had advanced Alzheimer's disease, he moved into a memory care community that I was running. And if he was not otherwise occupied, he would go room to room with his walker and he would find objects. Like, let's say he found this water bottle. He'd pick up an object and he'd put it in his walker basket and out he would go. Well-meaning staff members all over the world walk up to people like Art and they say, Art, I know you didn't mean to, but this belongs to Eric and we need to give it back. Art would say, no, you can't have that. Get away from me. And he would be ready for a fight. And the reason why is that he may not remember a lot of stuff, but his identity is certainly not that of a thief. He knows he's not a thief. He would never do that. The only reason that something was in his walker basket in his mind is if he was doing something good with it or if it was his. Now, if you go straight to the task of trying to put the object back in the other person's room, that's also falling into the task trap. So we have to set the task aside and connect first with the person. Terminate the task trap by seeing who Art is and make a meaningful connection. And the way that we do that most of the time is by being the long-lost friend. And so I'd give social proof that I knew him. Art, good to see you. How's the meatpacking business? We just had our best year yet, he'd say. Oh, that's wonderful. How's Elaine? Well, that was his wife. He had one answer for that. Best thing I ever did was marry that woman. And just that fast, in a matter of seconds, I'm his friend. And then I could do something that fit his identity. He sees himself as helpful and good and doing positive things. So I could pick up the object from the basket and say, oh my goodness, I can't believe it. I've been looking everywhere for this. You found it. What would I do without you? I know right where it goes. Let's put it away. And we'd walk back to wherever, pats on the back the whole way. and we'd put it away. Now, if someone had a lot more memory and there was more going on, we might not be able to use a technique like that. But Art had profound memory loss. He had no idea why that thing was in his basket. That worked consistently because it fit his identity. Well, as far as everyday life, Abraham Lincoln said tact is the ability to describe others as they see themselves. So, in the end, the vital five pillars are principles. Every good technique that I understand about dementia care tends to come from, at least as far as interpersonal technique. So let's review very quickly. If you want to remember these, just remember the word vital. V reminds us to validate the person's emotional experience. So we make the V with our hands as a reminder of that in our minds. I reminds us to improvise and be in the moment. T is in the middle because everything centers on that. I taught you about terminating the task trap first because everything hinges on that. We've got to make a meaningful connection with the person first because we let friends help us all the time. We don't let complete strangers assist us. And if there's no trust, we're sunk. A reminds us to accommodate sensory deficits. And in all of our relationships, it reminds us that not everyone sees things the way that we do. And we need to first seek to understand, then to be understood. L reminds us that life history gives us context and identity, and that makes it our most important tool. And in everyday interaction, we need to know something about other people. We need to understand how they're used to being perceived. If they're used to being treated like Joshua Bell, we need to treat them like Joshua Bell. If it's Charlie Chaplin, better treat them like Charlie Chaplin. Find out their identity and connect with them, and we'll be more tactful, like Abraham Lincoln reminded us. We all get further when we leverage these principles in everyday life. So we have just a few minutes. As I wrap up here, let's shift gears for those of you who are here live to see if you have questions, insights, examples, any ways that you've seen this play out, or anything that I might need to be clarifying.